You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, 48 hours of nonfiction books every weekend. And we are on the campus of George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., for our university series. We have the chance to come to some universities and talk with professors who have also written books that you might not have heard about. And joining us now is Meredith Lair, who's a history professor here at GMU, and her book is not quite out yet. It should be by the time this airs, but here is the cover of it, Armed with Abundance: Consumerism and Soldiering in the Vietnam War. Professor Lair, what was the typical experience of the American soldier in Vietnam?
Well, that's actually a great place to start, because I think the American public has an assumption about what that experience was that's been informed by television, by movies, by media coverage of the war, that tends to foreground the experience of a rifle platoon, the grunt who's humping the boonies, who's in imminent danger, who's living a life of austerity and deprivation and enduring frequent danger. And so that's a very powerful image. It's certainly an experience that many Vietnam veterans had during the war, but it is probably not the dominant experience of the war, because particularly by the late 1960s, the United States had built an incredible logistical apparatus to support its troops in combat. And so most soldiers serving in Vietnam were serving in some kind of support capacity, living largely out of harm's way, and as the war went on, and enjoying an increasingly comfortable quality of life that was designed to try to minimize the difference between living conditions in the U.S. and on a U.S. military base and living conditions in Vietnam.
How many soldiers at the peak, how many U.S. soldiers in Vietnam
The
at a
peak
time?
was in 1968, and it was about 542,000 Americans in Vietnam.
And how many American soldiers were killed that year? Do you know offhand?
Off the top of my head, I don't. I mean, it was the deadliest year in Vietnam because of the Tet Offensive and the mopping up operations after. So, you know, certainly I don't, in the book, deny the hardship that soldiers endured and the costs of the war in terms of blood and treasure and the emotional consequences of the war. But what I'm trying to do is to complicate people's ideas about what it meant to have served in Vietnam and what that experience was like, and also to give some credit to soldiers who don't see their experiences represented in film or television or other popular representations of the war.
Now, you have a chart in here, gross PX sales in Vietnam, fiscal years 1968 to 1972. 1968, $325 million
Right.
is what you have, down to up to $364 million in
Right.
1971. Why do you include this chart?
Well, one of the things that I examine is consumerism and the role that it played in American soldiers' lives. Military authorities in Vietnam recognized that providing consumer goods to American soldiers was a way of maintaining strong soldier morale. And that's pretty important in this war because it's very controversial, and there's a lot of people serving in Vietnam who don't want to be there. So providing easy access to consumer goods becomes a way of ameliorating some of the morale problems that military authorities are seeing. So they create this enormous post-exchange apparatus, basically a retail operation. So the U.S. military is functioning as a store and becomes, in essence, the third largest department store chain in the world as a consequence, with sales over a 3-4 year period of over $1 billion. And those figures, I should note, are not adjusted for inflation. So if they were adjusted for inflation, I don't have what those numbers would be, but it would be staggering.
What is this photo on the front of your book?
That's a photo that I found in an archive, the Vietnam archive at Texas Tech University, and that's 3 guys who are kind of playing around with their cameras. And the camera was really an essential purchase in Vietnam. It was something that was talked about a lot in publications for soldiers. It was a thing that guys would save up their paychecks to buy. And these things were pricey. These were not the little $99 point and shoots that we've become accustomed to, but these are very sophisticated cameras that could run several $100s. And it was really an iconic purchase of the war, and there was a really just a rash of photo taking. So I thought that was an interesting image, because here it's soldiers taking pictures of themselves taking pictures. And that's, I think, in essence, some of what the book is about, because it's how soldiers and other people regard the experience of the war.
Professor Lair, what was living in Saigon for a U.S. soldier in the late 60s like?
Well, it would depend on a few variables. There were some soldiers who were living in Saigon. They were stationed in quarters that were essentially hotels that had been rented out by the U.S. military. Living in Saigon created a lot of problems for the military because you had probably, I mean, tens, if not over 100,000 soldiers in the area by the mid-60s, like 67, 68, and it created a lot of problems because these guys are going out after hours, they're getting drunk, they are patronizing brothels. That is eroding relations with the Vietnamese that, for political reasons, need to be better, and also they're presenting themselves as targets for criminals who mug them or roll them as drunk if they're drunk, or occasionally for the Viet Cong who are lobbing, you know, grenades or setting off car bombs here and there in the city. And so, you know, if you were a soldier stationed in Saigon, life was really pretty good, and there were random acts of violence, and the Tet Offensive did bring the war to Saigon's doorstep in 1968. But for the most part, there are people who lived in Saigon or bases near there whose war experience was very, very isolated, and they really didn't feel like there was a war going on at all. And in fact, that's something that I quote in the book, soldiers saying, you know, if not for the information about the war that I'm getting from Stars and Stripes or from the radio, I wouldn't even know that I was in a war.
Where is this photo taken?
I think that was taken on the coast near Da Nang, but that's basically some guys who are getting ready for a party. So it's a different kind of beach landing where they have requisitioned the beer and the hot dogs, and they probably had grills already set up, and they are making this beach landing. So you can kind of make out that they're in their swim trunks and they're laden with supplies and they're going to have a party. And Philip Jones Griffiths, the photographer who took that particular image, has others of the beach, and it's of guys standing around barbecue pits, and the beach is literally just littered with empty beer cans. So a very incongruous image with what we traditionally see of the Vietnam War.
Who is Philip Jones Griffith?
I believe he's an Englishman who was a journalist who covered the war, and he was one of just a couple of photojournalists who was interested in this side of the war. That was something that proved very difficult when I was trying to find quality images to include in the book. I did find lots and lots of not so quality images that were taken by these very soldiers themselves who had very little facility with the cameras they were using, so lots of blurry shots, lots of darkened interiors. You know, the professional journalists, they were charged with getting a story that would help to sell papers. And so the war that they tended to focus on was the killing and dying war. And the images that they produced are incredibly powerful and beautiful. From the shooting war, people like Larry Burroughs and Henri Hewitt. I have a Hewitt photo in the book that's also very famous. But people like Philip Jones Griffiths, or there was another photographer that I talk a lot about, Mark Jury, who was actually a soldier journalist. They took photographs that captured this other side of the war and that really undermined the impression that the war was of great urgency for most Americans who were fighting it.
Meredith Lair, when did you get interested in the Vietnam War?
Very, very early in my life.
Why?
I did my first research report in 7th grade on Vietnam. So, and the reason was because I'm the daughter of a Vietnam veteran and a career military officer, and so the Vietnam War really, he spent two tours in Vietnam, and I think it really, you know, etched its mark on my family and on my parents' marriage and on their relationship with their children. And so I was fascinated by that, and also I grew up in the 1980s, and Vietnam was still a very raw subject for adults. And so I recognized that while my father was willing to talk about his experiences, most adults were not. And I had, and also I was trying to reconcile some competing messages that I was hearing from him about what his war was like at times with how the war was being represented in movies like Platoon.
And what did your father write in the prologue to your new book?
Well, I wrote the prologue, but it is about his experience in the war, and I wanted to do that because this is a very personal subject for me, and I wanted to explain the genesis of the book. So I basically described some of the contours of his service in Vietnam, which during his first tour took him to Quang Ngai province and was a very ascetic existence, living on an advisory compound with just a couple of maybe 20 Americans, and working solely with Vietnamese infantry. And it was very hard, it was very dangerous, and I think much